Seaman, Chapter 9, Searching for the Shoshone, mid-July through August 31st, 1805. Seaman splashed into the cold, clear water to escape the suffocating summer heat. He plunged his head under the river's surface to rid his eyes of the pesky gnats. But as soon as he scrambled out of the water, the sun beat down on his back again, and the gnats swarmed all over his face. The Missouri River no longer resembled its nickname, Old Muddy. Now it was a swift mountain stream tumbling over rocks and rushing around cliffs. As the men fought against its current, sweat slid down their necks. Sometimes the current was so strong they couldn't paddle or pull against it, so they had to pull the canoes with ropes for hours. All the while, the sun baked their shoulders and the chilly water numbed their legs. Mosquitoes buzzed around their ears. As the explorers followed the river toward its source, they were heading south. To their right, the Rocky Mountains stood like a wall between them and the western sea. The men shuddered when they looked at these pointed peaks, which seemed to pierce the very heavens. Unlike the tree-covered, rounded slopes of the Appalachian Range, the Rockies were jagged and steep, with snowy tops. Secretly, each man wondered whether the expedition would be able to cross such rugged mountains. The captains had already made a plan for the crossing. They knew that the Shoshone Indians, Sacagawea's people, lived on the eastern side of the Rockies. The Shoshones had plenty of horses. With Sacagawea's help as a translator, Lewis and Clark planned to trade for enough horses to carry the expedition's supplies. The captains hoped the Shoshones might also be willing to supply an Indian guide to show them the way through the steep mountains. On July 19th, Captain Lewis led the expedition up the river, while Captain Clark took a small party of men overland to search for the Shoshones. On the river, the canoes entered a canyon where rocky walls rose more than 1,000 feet. The water was too deep for the men to stand in it. They crossed through dark shadows cast by towering cliffs. The place was so remarkable that Lewis struggled for words to describe it. He finally named it the Gates of the Rocky Mountains. As the canoes emerged from the canyon, Seaman wolfed. His keen nose had picked up the smell of smoke. He rushed from one end of the canoe to the other, tensed for danger. The dugout canoe rocked with his movements. Lewis stood and scanned the sky. He spotted a thick column of smoke about 7 miles away. A large area of the prairie seemed to be burning. Lewis groaned. "What's wrong, Captain?" asked George Shannon. "That fire must have been deliberately set," Lewis said. "You think Captain Clark is signaling to us?" Lewis shook his head sadly. "I doubt it. Clark wouldn't have set the prairie on fire." "So, Indians must have set the fire," Shannon said cheerfully. "Guess we'll be meeting up with a band of Shoshones today or tomorrow." Lewis's face was grim. His eyes met Sacagawea's, and she nodded sadly, confirming his suspicions. "It's not going to be easy to meet up with the Shoshones now. More than likely, this fire was set by Indian scouts to warn their people of strangers in the area." Lewis frowned. "The scouts must have decided we're a war party, so they set a big noticeable fire to tell their band to keep out of sight." "Captain, if the Shoshones don't let us get near them, what will we do?" Shannon asked. "Without horses, how will we be able to get across the mountains before winter sets in?" Lewis did not answer, and they sat in silence for several minutes. Soon, Pomp awoke with a small whimper, and Sacagawea slid his cradle board off her shoulders. Seaman nuzzled Pomp's cheeks, bringing a smile to the baby's face. Sacagawea began to nurse her baby, and she sang a quiet, soothing song. As they listened to the song, Seaman edged closer to Lewis. His tail thumped gently, and Lewis's face began to relax. So far, the captain reflected, the Corps had found a way to overcome every challenge. They would find a way to cross the Rockies, and if they didn't, well, Lewis, for one, was willing to die trying. A few days later, on July 22nd, Sacagawea sat up and looked carefully at the land beside the river. "I have been here before, when I was a girl," she told Lewis. She spoke quietly, but with conviction. Lewis stared at her. "You recognize this place?" he asked. "Are you sure?" Sacagawea smiled. "Yes, I know this place," she said confidently. "In summer, my people sometimes camped along the banks of this river. Soon we will reach Three Forks, where 3 rivers join together to form the Missouri River." Lewis's mind was racing. If Sacagawea's people came here every summer, then surely the Shoshone were somewhere nearby. The explorers ought to be able to find them. Later that afternoon, Seaman began to bark, his tail wagging excitedly. The men steadied the canoe and searched the bank of the river. It was Captain Clark and his scouting party. The boats pulled close to shore, and Lewis jumped out, with Seaman splashing behind him. "William, we are nearing the headwaters of the Missouri," Lewis blurted out. "Sacagawea recognized this stretch of the river. She says her people camp here in summer. Have you seen any signs of the—" Suddenly, Lewis stopped speaking. Seaman was sniffing Clark's bare feet. They were a bloody mess. "What happened to your feet?" Lewis cried in alarm. "Prickly pear," Clark replied with disgust. "That cursed cactus grows so thick around here we couldn't avoid it. It ripped the soles of our moccasins to shreds." Lewis knelt to examine the soles of Clark's feet. "Seems it also ripped the soles of your feet to shreds." The overland party had cuts and blisters covering every inch of their feet. Lewis treated the cuts and opened the blisters so they would drain. He insisted the men stay off their feet for a day to let them heal. But the overland party had worse news than prickled feet. They had not succeeded in finding the Shoshones, and without Shoshone horses, the captains had no idea how to get across the mountains. Clark was determined to try again, despite his torn feet, and he set out the next day with 3 men. Lewis proceeded up the river with the rest of the corps. River travel became even harder. The current was swifter, the water was icier, but the sun remained every bit as hot. Walking along the riverbank was just as bad as boat duty. In Lewis's journal, he complained the expedition was bothered by a trio of pests: mosquitoes, eye gnats, and prickly pears. The men became so weary that Lewis tried to encourage them by adding his own muscle to the group's efforts. The captain himself took turns poling one of the canoes. As soon as travel conditions seemed as bad as they could get, they got worse. The explorers discovered needlegrass, a plant with sharp seeds that poked right through leather and stuck in their skin. The seeds had to be picked off one by one. Poor Seaman suffered mightily from this new pest. Lewis wrote that his dog was constantly binting and scratching himself as if in a rack of pain. "Maybe this river doesn't have an end," York said one evening. He was picking needlegrass seeds out of the legs of his buckskin pants. "Maybe it just twists around like a big old knot and will go round and round in it, retracing our own steps." Coulter grinned. "It has to have an end, York. Every river has an end. We just haven't found it yet." Seaman nodded his back legs, trying to pull out needlegrass seeds. Coulter sat down on the ground next to him. "Take it easy, Seaman. You're going to chew holes in your skin." Coulter began to pick the seeds out of the dog's fur, and Seaman stretched out on his side, panting. After a few minutes, Coulter gently stroked the dog's fur. "That's all I can do, Seaman. It's so dark I can't see the seeds anymore." "Maybe this here river does have an end," York continued, "but you think we're ever going to find it? Seems to me the days are getting shorter. I used to finish cooking supper before it got dark. Now I can hardly gather the kindling before dark." Coulter stared at the black river. "It does get dark sooner every day, York. Winter always comes early in the high country." "Captain Clark says we can't cross the mountains in winter. You reckon we'll make winter camp out here?" "I don't think there's enough game out here to last the winter," Coulter said. "We haven't seen a herd of buffalo in days. If we don't get across the Rockies soon, I think the expedition will have to turn back." The river began to curve toward the southeast, which worried Lewis. That meant they were traveling in a direction exactly opposite their goal. The men's spirits sank as low as the river's chilly bottom. Not even Seaman splashing merrily through the water could bring a smile to Lewis's face. Unless their luck changed, and changed quickly, the Lewis and Clark expedition seemed to be doomed. On July 27th, the river came into a wide valley. A second river rushed at the men, and a little ways upstream, a third river rushed downstream to join the other waterways. At last, they had reached the spot described by the Indians at Fort Mandan and by Sacagawea, 3 forks. Lewis ordered the men to pull the canoes onto the banks. He whistled for Seaman, and they climbed a nearby hill. Below them were the 2 valleys. To the south and east, they could see the 2 rivers flowing through one of the valleys, and from the southwest came the 3rd river flowing through the 2nd valley. The waters from all 3 rivers merged into the Missouri. Lewis sat on the ground and patted his leg for Seaman to sit beside him. As he stroked Seaman's fur, his mood began to lift. The green valleys stripped with rivers lay below them. Around them, snow-capped mountains formed a jagged border against the sky. No other American citizen had ever seen this beautiful place, Lewis thought. The core of discovery had come so far. He wanted to preserve this sight, this moment in his mind. Even if they didn't reach the Pacific Ocean, he told himself, the explorers had accomplished so much. The Corps made camp at Three Forks. That afternoon, Clark and his overland party tramped in wearily. Clark was feeling sick with a fever and muscle aches. Even worse, he reported that his party had not spotted a single Shoshone. The explorers stayed at Three Forks for the next 2 days while Clark recovered. There was plenty to do. The men tanned hides to make clothes and moccasins. Coulter took Seaman out hunting. Although there were no buffalo, deer were still plentiful, and Coulter brought back several bucks. York and Charbonneau prepared hearty meals for the tired travelers. As they sat around the evening fire, Cruzat played his fiddle and Shannon sang a silly song to amuse baby Pomp. Seaman settled down near the baby, rested his head on his front paws, and dozed. When Sacagawea began to speak, Seaman lifted his head and cocked his ears. All of the explorers stopped to listen, for Sacagawea ordinarily spoke very little. This is the place, 5 summers ago, where I last saw my family. Her steady voice told the story of the Hidatsa raiding party that came upon her Shoshone camp. We ran for 3 miles and hid ourselves in the woods, but the Hidatsa braves chased us. When they found us, they killed 4 of our men and 4 of our women, and they killed many of our young boys. Most of us became their prisoners. They took us far away from this place, far down the Missouri River, the same river we have just traveled up so many miles. They took us to their villages near Fort Mandan. George Shannon looked at Sacagawea's eyes, bright in the firelight. How old were you when you were taken prisoner? He asked. I had seen 12 summers, she said simply. Although her words were heartbreaking, Sacagawea spoke without any display of her feelings. She did not weep or complain. This was her story, and she accepted it as the grass accepts the sun and the sky accepts the thunder. Nobody spoke. After a few minutes, Cruzat played a slow, lonely song on his fiddle. When the men of the Corps were living at Fort Mandan, the last landmark the Indians could describe to them was Three Forks. Now that the expedition had reached Three Forks, the captains were on their own. Nobody had given them any advice about which way to continue traveling west. They didn't know which of the Three Forks to follow, so they chose a river that curved to the west, since that was the direction of the Pacific Ocean. They named it the Jefferson River in honor of the president. While Clark led the canoes up the river, Lewis led short scouting parties overland to search for Shoshone Indians. He left Seaman with the canoes, because the Shoshones might be scared off by the sight of such a big dog, but Lewis's luck was no better than Clark's had been. On August 8th, Sacagawea recognized another landmark, a rise her people called the Beaver's Head. She said this was near a place where the Shoshone lived during the summer months. Now this was encouraging news. Lewis took 2 men and set out to locate the Indians, leaving Seaman with Clark and the others. Canoe travel had become impossibly slow. The Jefferson River was more like a shallow stream than a river. They were frustrating delays when the canoes got stuck on boulders or tree roots. Seaman splashed along the icy, shallow water as the men strained against the ropes. The group came to the mouth of another stream, and Clark wasn't sure which waterway was the Jefferson River. Although they kept expecting to see Lewis or one of his scouts return with some news, days passed with no word. On August 17th, the men were dragging the canoes when Seaman barked and took off on a gallop. A few minutes later, he returned with one of Lewis's scouts and an Indian brave. The Indian was so thin his ribs stuck out. He wore a cloth around his waist, a baggy vest, and a brightly colored cloth headband. Clark waved. He turned to Sacagawea and asked, "Is the brave one of your people?" Sacagawea smiled and nodded. "He wears the clothing of my people." "Captain Clark," called the scout. "Captain Lewis is in camp with the Shoshone chief. We saw the Indians' horse herd. They have about 400 animals." Clark told the explorers to beach the boats. He ordered some men to guard the supplies and told the others to follow him. Taking Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Seaman, he hurried ahead. As they rounded a bend, Seaman dashed up the bank, barking happily. In a minute, Clark saw Lewis waving to them, his face beaming. Seaman bounded to Lewis, wagging his tail. Lewis threw his arms around Seaman, letting the dog cover his face with wet kisses. He buried his hand in Seaman's warm fur and gave a silent prayer of thanks. At last, the Corps of Discovery was together again. They had finally located the Shoshones, and the Indians had plenty of horses to trade. The Indians crowded around, eager for a look at the newcomers. Clark ran up to Lewis and held him by his shoulders. "Meriwether, you did it! You found the Shoshones!" "I am so glad to see you, William. We've been camped here for days, waiting." Lewis's words rushed out. "When you didn't come, the Indians started grumbling. They thought I was playing some sort of trick on them. I was afraid they would leave before you arrived with the trade goods." Lewis stroked Seaman's head and told him to sit. "Stay, Seaman." Seaman responded immediately. He sat, his eyes searching Lewis's face. He did not move a muscle, except the tip of his tail, which wagged back and forth. Then Lewis led Clark to the Shoshone chief. "Come away." The chief grasped Clark and gave him a full-body hug, a traditional greeting among Shoshone men. Kamawait decorated Clark's hair with shells to honor him. The Indians gathered around to watch, smiling at the explorers. These men were the first people the Shoshones had ever seen who were not Indians. The greetings began, and the explorers found themselves smothered with hugs. Several of the Shoshones marveled at Seaman. They made the sign for bear and seemed astonished that the big dog would sit so patiently. The Indians said the dog's intelligence was astonishing. The Indians also seemed amazed that a man could have black skin. They eagerly touched the bare skin on York's neck and arms when they hugged him. Suddenly, a woman screamed. Everyone froze, startled. Seaman woofed and sprang to his feet. His eyes scanned the people's faces, searching for danger. One of the Shoshone women clutched Sacagawea, and both began to cry out. The women recognized each other. They had been childhood friends. The two were in the same camping party when the Hidatsa raiders took Sacagawea prisoner. In fact, the woman had acquired her name Jumping Fish from the way she had leaped across the stream to escape from the Hidatsas. The explorers watched, astonished, as quiet, calm Sacagawea screamed and danced around, weeping with joy. The two young women hugged, tears streaming down their cheeks. Then they laughed through their tears, grasping each other's shoulders to gaze in wonder into each other's faces. Words tumbled from their mouths. After a few minutes, the women quieted down. Sacagawea slid Pomp off her back and showed him to her friend. Jumping Fish held the baby in her arms and drenched him with teary kisses. Late that afternoon, after the greetings were finished, the captains held a meeting with Kamawait and some of his braves. Sacagawea was the translator, and Seaman sat calmly by her side. The men were deep into their talk when Sacagawea suddenly stopped translating. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Kamawait. Puzzled, the captain stared at her. Ignoring the awkward silence, Sacagawea called out a few words in Shoshone. She jumped up and ran to Chief Kamawait. Then she threw her arms around him and held on. Lewis looked at Charbonneau. "What's going on?" he asked. "Sacagawea just recognized her brother." Astounded, the men stared. Sacagawea called the Shoshone chief by his childhood name. Kamawait smoothed his sister's hair, looked into her eyes, and tenderly held her slender face in his large weathered hands. Sacagawea unwound the blanket tied around her waist and threw it over their heads so she could weep with Kamawait in private. Sobs shook her body as she held her brother, now a grown man and the leader of the people she had been torn from as a girl. After a while, Sacagawea returned quietly to her seat in the circle. Seaman crept to her side. She laid a hand on the dog's broad back as if to steady himself. The men resumed their talk, and Sacagawea translated. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and several times her face crumpled. She had to pause and hold her hand in front of her eyes, struggling to compose herself. Finally, she nodded at the captains, and the meeting continued. Kamawait remained calm, as befitted the leader of his people, but his eyes looked lovingly on this young woman who had been a little girl when last they called each other brother and sister. The Shoshone Indians helped the explorers carry their baggage over the first high pass in the Rockies. Seaman ran alongside the Indians and the explorers on the steep trail, wearing his saddlebags packed full of goods. Food was scarce, but the two groups shared what little they had. By August 26th, the work was complete. That night, the explorers held a party in camp to thank the Indians. Cruzat played his fiddle and the men danced. York danced a jig and the Indians called out their appreciation for his nimble feet. It was a merry evening, but the leaders of both groups were nervous. Early that morning there had been frost. The Shoshones were eager to reach the buffalo hunting grounds on the plains to lay in a store of meat for the winter. Without this food supply, their band would starve in the coming months. The explorers had to get enough horses to carry them across the mountains before the snows came, or their group would also starve to death. Over the next few days, horse trading occupied most of the leaders' time. Seamen sat near the captains as they haggled for horses. At first, bargaining was easy. The Indians were delighted to trade such a common item as a horse for novelties like cloth, shirts, or mirrors. But soon the Indians realized the explorers were desperate to acquire horses and would pay whatever they could. In just a few days, the price of Shoshone horses greatly increased. The explorers bargained away some of their dearest possessions, knives, guns, and ammunition. In the end, they got their horses, 29 of them, but the animals did not come cheaply. It was not the Shoshone custom to travel west toward the Pacific Ocean, but one older man in their band, old Toby, had made this journey years ago. He knew the way through the mountains, and he agreed to guide the expedition. Both the Indians and the explorers were keenly aware that winter was closing in. It was critical to be on their separate ways. For Sacagawea, this was a painful thought. She had been torn away from her family, friends, and homeland when she was only a girl of 12. For so many years, she held no hope of seeing any of her people again. Miraculously, in the last 2 weeks, she had been reunited with both her brother and her childhood friend. But she was a young mother herself now with her own husband and family. She had a job to do for the Corps of Discovery. Together with Charbonneau and the explorers, she turned toward the west and the unknown lands leading to the Pacific Ocean. How she yearned in her heart to be turning east with the people of her birth. Sacagawea sent her farewells to her people. As always, she accepted her future without complaint, as a stream accepts melting snow in spring and cooling rain in autumn. Seaman stayed close to the horse that Sacagawea rode as the explorers waved goodbye to the Shoshone. He sensed that this trail was steeper for the young Indian woman than for the other explorers.